Roddy?
Jeff.
Hey.
Hi, how's it going?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well. I actually have notes today.
Okay. Okay, everybody, welcome to the podcast. It's a little too quiet. It's the Ferndale Library podcast. It's brought to you by the Friends of the Ferndale Library. Is that the whole intro? I don't know. It's Jeff. Hey, Roddy, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Jeff.
And here we are. You brought notes, and you've been so gracious to contribute to so many romance podcasts recently. So glad you're here for a horror podcast.
Yes, I'm here to talk about horror books.
You were like also so ready and eloquent to just dive in and talk so expansively on romance also, but now you've got notes. Now I'm like excited and exhilarated and maybe even scared, so I don't even know where.
Okay, well, don't be too scared. My notes are basically just like a list of things so that I don't forget particular books and also some author names.
Okay.
So that I don't forget those either. But I'm already looking, and Jeff, would you believe that I did not write down all the author names? It's fine. It's fine. So welcome again to the podcast, everyone. Jeff was so gracious because I ambushed him several days ago and I was just like, we need to do a horror podcast. It is spooky month.
Right now.
And so we are not a little too quiet today. We are a little too spooky today because we are talking about horror. There we go, Jeff. A very corny joke just for you.
Yes. Love it.
So I feel like horror is a very interesting genre because personally, if you would have asked me like 2, 3, 4+ years ago if I liked horror, my answer would be not really, no. I was the child at like sleepovers who really couldn't handle certain horror movies, who would get like really bad nightmares and, would... My aunt let me watch The Ring, for example, when it came out, and I was pretty young when that movie came out, and I slept in my mom's room for 2 weeks straight. Like, if you ask me, me and horror just did not mesh. I was never like clamoring to go see them in the theaters, but I saw a lot of horror movies because, as I said, they're kind of a sleepover staple.
Okay.
And it's not that I was going to a ton of those, but it was just scary movies and anime.
Okay, so when you say you weren't really into horror, do you really mean that across the board, or is like where were you when it came to the books?
So this is where it gets interesting because actually one of the things that I wrote down is that I didn't think I liked it, but I loved Goosebumps when I was a child.
Me too.
You'd be hard pressed to find a kid who didn't like R.L. Stine. I think we even had like a VHS where they had filmed some of the stories and turned them into like short films. I had that and I would watch it all the time. There is one called like the Tower of Terror, not to be confused with the Disney one, but like it was like a medieval time travel one where like this girl and her brother were trapped in a tower by like their evil monarch uncle or something like that. I don't remember all the details. I loved it.
Here you are. You could have named any Goosebumps book, but you named my favorite one.
Yeah, I love that one.
Roddy.
Also, we have done a podcast on this, but I love the Twilight Zone.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So the funny thing for me is that I love the Twilight Zone, not really realizing that so much of it actually is horror. I say that, but like I don't like ventriloquy and those things. Like the episodes with the puppets, puppets, unless it's Sesame Street.
Sure.
I don't do puppets. So but speaking of books, there is a particular story that I feel like very many children read in their formative years about a girl with a green ribbon around her neck.
Roddy.
Yes.
This
and
is
I was
my
just
music.
like, I was obsessed with that when I was a kid. And of course, Edgar Allan Poe and all that stuff. But even knowing that I liked all of those horror related things, if you asked me several years ago, I'd be like, yeah, no, I don't really do horror. I don't really do horror. But with the past couple of years, I have been reading a lot of horror books
Okay.
and really, really liking them. So this isn't within the past couple of years. This is like a decade ago, but I did get introduced to Junji Ito, which if you are familiar with manga, he is like the leading mangaka for horror or one of them. And so he's written a lot. Like people know Tomie, which is the girl with the face on the side of her face. Netflix has done some adaptations of his stories. You can find other adaptations on Crunchyroll and stuff like that. So I went through this thing where I was like, maybe I just really like non-Western horror. Like maybe I like really like weird psychological body horror that's not gore because I still don't particularly care for gore. It doesn't bother me, but I'm just like, you're not gonna get, I don't like shock value horror at all.
What about body horror? Because isn't that kind of like Junji Ito's
Well,
Uzumaki thing?
yeah, but I feel like it can be accomplished in ways that's not necessarily gore or shock value.
Okay,
Like you
sure.
have your, not all slasher movies are like this, but for example, the Saw
Hmm.
movies, which I'm speaking from a person who doesn't watch them, has never felt like watching them. I've never been called or pulled towards that kind of horror. That just doesn't appeal to me. But like Junji Ito, the world is turning into spirals. You are turning into spirals. There are metaphysical things that are at play here that you cannot comprehend, but they are affecting your physical being. Yeah, that's freaky. That's cool.
Wow.
That's good. But so I've slowly but surely been reading more and more horror books, but it's kind of been by way of me reading Gothic novels,
Hmm.
which we've also talked about on the
Hmm.
podcast, because I think that there's Gothic novels are a pretty cool gateway to horror and introducing yourself to forms of horror that you might like. So I even included some books on this list that are definitely, in my opinion, more Gothic than horror. So we have Mexican Gothic on here, which you were horrified by. And I was just like, oh, yeah, I think that's just, yeah, yeah, it's kind of horrifying when you think about it. But I was like, yeah, no, this is cool.
I'll edit this out later. There's a fucking mummy.
I didn't, I mean,
6 stars out of 5. So scary.
I'm just saying, Jeff, it didn't really register. I was like listening, and that's the thing. We're talking about something when we're talking about horror, it's just like there people have such different thresholds for it because you were horrified as you should have been by that book. And yes, there were horrifying concepts, but I was like, no, this is fine. And
Hmm.
then talking to you about it, I'm like, no, that actually really is horrific. There's actually a book and just another book that I think is more gothic, or a few other books that I think lean more gothic than horror for me personally. Silver Nitrate, which is also by Silvia Moreno Garcia. And then we have The Bewitching, which is her latest book. I like her a lot if you haven't noticed this by now.
Hmm.
Then there's Hungerstone, which is a Carmilla retelling or reimagining that recently came out that I read with a bunch of friends and we all loved it. And then on the sort of like vampire train, we have another book called Dowry of Blood. These are the authors that I didn't write down.
Ooh.
And that those are not horror. Those are not particularly gory to me from my recollection of them, but they did feel very gothic. They did feel very dark. They are very much in tune with the season.
Okay, so
Then,
S.T. Gibson
yes, S.T. Gibson for
and
Dowry of
and
Blood.
and Cat Dunn.
Yes, for Hungerstone.
Oh my gosh.
Excellent book. Oh my
Excellent
goodness.
cover.
And then I just kind of found myself really diving in because in the romance podcast, I've kind of like said I haven't really been reading romance that much lately. I haven't really been reading romance that much lately, and it just hasn't been speaking to me the way that it used to. But I've really been resonating with and really felt myself drawn to a lot of horror books. And there are some beloved horror authors out there, like Grady Hendrix. I've only read one of his books. I read Final Girl Survival Guide. I really enjoyed it more than I thought I would. And that's the only book by by him that I've actually read. So I can't blanketly endorse him
Oh,
or,
there's a book.
why.
There's a book of his I've read called How to Sell a Haunted House.
Uh-huh.
And he actually came on this podcast for that
Oh,
book, and he was so charming.
oh,
And
well, that's a delight.
oh, you know what else is a delight? Is that
What?
book centers around ventriloquism. So
Uh,
maybe you should. There's a
sorry.
puppet. It's a spooky puppet book.
Listener, you could not see this, but I just grimaced. So I don't like puppets, man. There's
Oh my
something
gosh.
about them that
I should have
freak
been
me
should have
out.
been but wait, Roddy, there's some strings attached.
Oh God. Um and then I have mentioned T. Kingfisher on this podcast, Lord knows how many times, also known as Ursula Vernon. Is
Mm-hmm.
that right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
She writes excellent horror, and she also writes really great horror that is just they're short books. They're not super long books. She knows how to tell a tight narrative
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
story. I read the twisted ones. There's oh my god, there's so many more, and I haven't even written them all down. She did an excellent take on the fall of the House of Usher called "What Moves the Dead" that had me looking at hares and rabbits weird for years now since I've read it. Just anything that T. Kingfisher writes that has to do with horror, she gets it. And the thing about it is she tells these tight stories. They're scary, they're immersive, they will freak you out. The twisted ones had me on the edge of my seat. But I think that part of the art that you get from a horror book that horror movies don't necessarily get to do so much is that horror books really allow for the suspense and the atmosphere to take over that movies as a visual medium don't always get to do because they have to have something more visually stimulating. And that's another reason why I think that I found my sort of gateway to horror by reading because I'm like, oh, this is fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I have a long list in front of me. There is Darcy Coates, who I feel like I've mentioned before, From Below. If you are like I am and you cannot swim and you fear the ocean because you respect the ocean, From Below is an excellent book to remind you of why you are afraid of the ocean because it is about deep sea diving to sort of uncover debris from a sunken ship.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm not mistaken, how it's told over multiple perspectives, and also you flip through multiple time periods as well. And it's so long, but it is so good. And I was on the edge the entire time I was reading it. And a really good filler for the way that she writes her horror is she has a collection of short stories called Ghost Camera, where the first story is about a ghost camera. I loved Ghost Camera. I actually listened to it when I was doing a like 10-hour long road trip. It wasn't a 10-hour long audiobook, but I listened to the stories as I was driving, and it was there were points where I had to pause. I was just like, just clenching my steering wheel, like,
Yes.
oh my God. And yeah, no, those two, T. Kingfisher and Darcy Coates actually just had a book that came out, if I'm not mistaken, too. And I cannot wait to get my hands on it. I'm on hold for it for a while now.
Okay. Dead of Winter. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah.
I need to read Dead of Winter. I actually really need to jump
Oh.
even further into her catalog. I've been working through her Gravekeeper series, which I think is about 5 books right now. I've read the first 3. So
How Bad Things Can Get is the newest
yes,
book.
that's the one. That's the one I'm waiting for. It just came out this year.
Whoa. Wow.
So, um, and that's the other thing about horror books. I actually really find them to be very immersive in both audiobook form and in reading form. And there are a couple of horror books where I've listened to them and I'm just like, I don't even know how someone could read this book. Like I almost feel like you have to listen to it.
Mm-hmm.
And the primary book that comes to mind for that is called Episode 13 by Craig DiLouie. I'm sorry, I told you, Jeff, I had notes this time. I was
Episode
like, I'm
13.
going to rattle these books off.
All right.
So, Episode 13 is probably one of the I have a couple of books where I'm just like, you need to listen to the audiobook if you are able to. Don't even bother like reading the physical book if you can, because the audiobook is so good. Episode 13 is about a ghost hunting television series
Okay.
where it's this husband and wife team, and they have other team members, but essentially they go around to haunted houses. His wife is a scientist, like full on scientist, not religious, does not like, if she can't prove it through science, she doesn't really believe in it. And he had a ghost encounter as a child that has left him very invested and obsessed with, in a good way, the supernatural and paranormal. So they kind of do this like ghost busters, ghost hunters s TV show where they record these phenomena and they decide, based off of it. Well, they don't decide, but they leave it up to the audience, like based off the evidence for like scientific explanation and paranormal explanation. Do you think this place is haunted? And the episode, or I'm sorry, the book is about the 13th episode where their entire team, which is the husband and wife team, an ex cop who had a ghost encounter or a questionable paranormal encounter when he was in the line of duty, and an actress who, let's be real, is trying to collect a check and hopefully get to her next big gig, and their cameraman, they get permission to explore and search this essentially abandoned house that during the 70s was used for like paranormal experiments, but all of the scientists disappeared and no one knows what happened to them. And when I tell you that this is one of the most investing audiobooks I've ever listened to, they have actors for every single character. There's the narrator's voice, which of course this all sounds overstimulating. There's music in the background. Like it's a full production audiobook, because there are times where there are characters who are talking at the same time, like interrupting each other. And the audiobook is able to capture that in
Yes.
ways that have me going, how did they even print this book? Like, how does this book look in print? Because I'm so curious about how it was done. But the audiobook was great. And it also had me pausing, not because I was necessarily afraid. There were things that were scary, but also because I'm just like, these characters, like, why would you split up? Why would you do this? It's just really well done.
Pacing?
And yeah, I enjoyed it.
Pacing is okay?
Pacing is good.
Episode
I
13.
feel like the end of the book, this is one thing that I will say is pretty common for me with horror books. I feel like horror books sometimes have a hard time sticking the landing. There was a portion towards the end of episode 13 that I personally was like, I could have done without this.
Mhm.
And shocking to say, I also feel that way about the
Mhm.
Buffalo Hunter.
Mhm.
I just finished that this weekend.
Now
To be
I think
clear,
I think that's
good
also
book.
kind of a long book.
It's a long book,
Yeah.
excellently written.
Mhm.
I
Well,
have to say, I felt more sad. I'm not going to get too deep because I know that this is also the book club pick.
this is the author who did is it Good Little Indians, or was
The
it
Only Good
The
Indians
Only
or
Good
something like
Indians?
that.
Yes, yes.
And My Life as a Teenage Slasher. I need to read
Yeah.
more of his
Yeah.
books.
Okay.
This one was the one. So this book moved very slow, which I'm fine with. I don't mind a slow moving book. The way that the horror unfolds is something that I found really intriguing. But the thing about it is that Stephen Graham Jones, who is an Indigenous man, writes his books from the perspectives of Indigenous characters.
Hmm.
And I'm just going to be completely honest with you. An Indigenous man in the 19th century, early 20th century, exacting revenge on people who wronged him, who were more often white settlers. I'm not gonna be that scared for them. But when you finally realize what's going on in the story, and I felt more horror at what the character Goodstab goes through as he loses and tries to hold on to his identity as a byproduct of what's happened to him. I was far more moved by that than any of the horrible things that he did. I was just like, but there's this section of the book, the last, like, I would say 50 to 70 pages, Jeff, it could have been 20. It could have been 20 pages.
Ooh.
But I don't think that was just my personal feeling towards the book. I think that it's a really good book. I had to remember or remind myself multiple times that it was a horror book, though, because, like I said, I wasn't afraid for those characters. I wasn't afraid for the things that, like, there wasn't a moment where I was on edge for what the characters were experiencing. And I think that's because of the limits of my empathy for those characters rather than the limits of the book itself. So I'm not judging the book based off of that.
That's a whole thing.
Yes.
You have to get me to care about these characters. Otherwise, I don't know how much I'm going to care about whether or not you're in danger from being killed by starving saints.
Jeff, that book made you so mad. It's so funny. After we talked about that book, I canceled my hold for it because I tried to read the physical book. And then I was like, I'll listen. When you started talking it up, I was like, okay, maybe I'll listen to the audiobook. And then you said that, I was like, never mind.
Well, it's the whole thing is there has to be a little bit of work. And it could be as easy as 3 pages or 5 pages. You have to develop your characters a bit in order for us to care about them and get that empathy is exactly what you were talking about with Buffalo Hunter. Yeah.
And that sort of thing about empathy is what made it very difficult, but not in a bad way, for me to not finish, but to just, how do I want to put this? So The Reformatory by Tananarive Due, it took me the entire month of September to read that book.
Well,
and Jeff,
you know
me. Jeff, you know me, though. I am a fast reader.
Right.
So for me to, like, I had to pace myself through that book because I was stressed for the characters. I empathized with the characters. I was worried for them. I wasn't terrified of the ghosts in that story. I was terrified of the people in that story because The Reformatory is a story about a young boy who does a very brief, foolish act and is sent to a reformatory school for young men. This is set during the 1950s in Florida. He is a Black young man, a boy, literally. He's a child. He's like 12. He's a baby. And his father has been essentially run out of town due to baseless accusations because his father was trying to help the workers unionize. So they but he was accused of doing something really horrible that is heavily implied that he could not and would not have done. And he had to run away up north, leaving his daughter and son behind, and their mother passed away several years before. So the son goes to the reforming school, and it's very obvious that the school is haunted because something horrible happened there before. And his older sister is trying desperately to get him out of there, appealing to any and all authorities that she can. They both have specific sensitivities of the paranormal nature. I won't go too into detail, but you take horror of like the genre of ghosts and bodily harm and hauntings, and then you combine that with the horror of 1950s American racism in the Deep South and all of the prejudices and anti-Semitism and all of the anti-everythings that you could think of, and you take all of that, I mean, the homophobia, Tananarive Due touched on so many things with the characters that I was just like, that book needed to be that long because of how many characters she introduced, how they played into the story, and the purposes that they served. And because I felt so much empathy for those characters, it was incredibly difficult for me to read. And I was just like, I need them to get some sort of relief. I need something to go well. That book stressed me out.
Whoa. Okay, what other books are on your list before I
On my
ramble and get philosophic?
Okay, so I also have You Weren't Meant to Be Human, which definitely goes into the like empathy by Andrew Joseph White. The empathy that I was just talking about, it took me a month to read the Reformatory. It took me a day to read that, not because it was better, not because it was worse,
Yeah.
but because I was so like I was so distressed by what I was reading. I needed to watch. I needed to see it come to
Oh
fruition.
my gosh.
The You Weren't Meant to Be Human is a story about a trans man who becomes pregnant while involved with, calling it a cult doesn't even get to the heart of what's
Wow.
going on there, but he's essentially beholden to this sort of alien mass known as the Hive. And the horror in that book is not even the Hive, which takes the form of worms in his particular instance, but in other colonies, because there are several colonies, they take on the shape of other bugs. They are always bugs. Ugh, just fair warning. But that book almost like made me stop reading for a minute, because that book deals with bodily autonomy horror.
Okay.
It deals with transphobia. It deals with, homophobia. It deals with a lot of like really difficult topics, but like it's really about, well, I don't want to say it's really about anything, but like I could not escape the like distress and just the pure like horror and fear that came from like knowing that this particular character who was trying to live his life as himself and find freedom not only does not have the freedom that he hoped to have, but like does not have the bodily autonomy that he wanted. Oh my God, Jeff, I've never been more stressed other than reading the Reformatory, to the point to where I was like, I don't think I'm allowed to read any more horror this year. I
Well,
was
it's
like,
gonna.
I might be done.
I was gonna ask, why do you do this to yourself? Yeah.
Yeah, no, it was I read that also with a group of friends, and we were just like, yeah, no. One of them listened to the audiobook. I was like, you're nuts. I was like, why would you do that to yourself?
You.
Only because the Hive apparently sounds horrifying in audio format. I was just like, Um, other than that, I just had some authors. I had Victor LaValle, who's known for Ballad of Black Tom and The Changeling.
Changeling. That book ruled.
It's so good.
Changeling.
I have The September House by Carissa Orlando, which is a really fun take on a haunted house.
Okay.
Really recommend that. But content warnings for alcoholism and domestic violence, and just when it comes to horror books, and also any books, but especially horror books, I highly recommend that people read content warnings before they dive into them, because horror so often crosses over with various forms of violence that could be really distressing for people to read. And I think that's another reason why people hesitate to dive into the genre. So I do think that that's something where I actually like, it's an area where I especially recommend like knowing what you are getting into. Diavola by Jennifer Thorne. I think that was the first book I read this year. Family Vacation from Hell. That's the best way to describe it. House of Hunger and Year of the Witching by Alexis Henderson. Both lean more towards Gothic to me, but I enjoyed the ending to Year of the Witching pissed me off. I'm just going to be honest. And there's supposed to be a sequel, but unfortunately, I don't know if there will be, because Alexis Henderson published it right before the pandemic started. And there were some similarities between real life and what was going on during the pandemic. And if I'm not mistaken, she just kind of said, like, I need to step away from this world, which I fully respect. So know that the Year of the Witching is technically part of something that's unfinished, because I didn't care for the ending, but I liked the book leading up to it. And then finally, this is more fantasy horror. It's a fantasy book, but I do feel like it belongs in the horror category despite not being quite like scary horror. But I've mentioned it before, which is Helm of Midnight by Marina Lostetter. That's a really, really good book. Interesting magic system. Imagine that essentially, like, your a person's essence can be imbued in a mask, and if you wear the mask you can recall some of their memories, some of their knowledge. So let's say there's someone who's a really famous doctor, they have a death mask made, you can put that mask on and you can learn how they did certain procedures or treated certain illnesses and like that. Well, that's all fine and dandy, that's great in theory, but what if the mask is for a notorious serial killer and someone is going around, replicating that serial killer's crimes. So yeah, that was kind of that was a little stressful. So I think that's the like shotgun list of everything that I wrote down.
Okay.
So let's get philosophical with it,
Okay,
Jeff.
sure. Sure. What elements most of all do you think you're drawn to or find most fulfilling when you have a good horror book that you really enjoyed?
I So it depends on the mood. I do think that characters I can empathize with is probably the top thing. And, people might say, oh, well, you should be able to empathize with most characters. And I mean, in an ideal world, yes, but that's not always the case. Like in the Buffalo Hunter, I don't want to spoil who the characters are, but the priest that or pastor, I don't know what the technical term is, that Good Stab is in dialogue with, quite literally. I found it hard to empathize with him and his fears for reasons that became justified by the end of the story. And whereas on the other hand, you weren't meant to be human. I am not a trans person. However, I that is one of the times I have most deeply empathized with a character. So I think that humanizing your characters is important. Because on the other end, like I was able to empathize very deeply with Good Stab. Excellent character, no notes. But that's one thing. I do think that if someone might find this kind of off-putting, but I do think that interjecting a little humor in your horror is really important. I found that to be of use with Final Girl Survival Guide. I found that to be of use with all of T. Kingfisher's writing. Darcy Coates also does that, because the thing about horror is that you can't just have your reader spend all of their time in one extreme.
Sure.
You need to make sure that it's counterbalanced in some sort of way. And humor technically is on the opposite end of the spectrum of, so knowing how to interject it into your story to give your reader some moments of relief are really important, because as much as I love the Reformatory, there was never a moment where I was like laughing ever. I was like, man, like I could use a chuckle here or there. And it's not to diminish like how, impactful the story was or the subject matter is really no laughing matter. But I think that that's something that also can help, especially if you're dealing with people who are not familiar with or comfortable with the genre, you know?
I was just thinking, at the Ferndale Project Book Club, we wind up reading a lot of this amorphous yet you kind of you know it when you know it genre known as literary fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And I have found that when a lot of those book club members are reading these literary fictions, if they don't like the character, they don't like the book. And I've always pushed against that.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it wasn't a worthwhile argument.
Mm-hmm.
However, I'm beginning to think that it has merits when it's in the horror genre. I think we could speak simply, and obviously argue with me if you want, that it is kind of crucial to like the characters and quote unquote, interpret that however you want when you're going along for the ride of a horror novel.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. Like I said, literally like minutes ago, I enjoyed the Buffalo Hunter. You cannot get me to feel bad for a group of oppressing people who are being tormented by a member of the group that they oppressed. As far as I'm concerned, Good Stab did nothing wrong. And
Right.
I don't think that's really what the takeaway from the story should be. But as a byproduct of like the historical makeup of this country, that's just what my takeaway is.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that saved the book for me is just how much I did empathize with Good Stab, because I was just like, oh, for some people, he would be the villain. But for me, he is both the hero and victim of this story.
Yes.
Like I said, I don't want to get too deep into the details
Sure.
of it,
Sure.
but
Okay.
even in a horror movie, there's the whole like final girl thing where it's like one character, you need one character to survive and stuff like that. I think that horror books also, you gotta have one person that you can root for in a
Sure.
horror book, because unfortunately, these are characters who are having really unfortunate things happen to them, and that's putting it lightly.
Sure.
And you have to, unfortunately, like, while I do think that I can empathize in general, the Buffalo Hunter an exception. But, even in books where I'm not too crazy about all of the characters, I can still feel bad for them that something horrible is happening to them. I can still empathize with some of their plights. I think empathy is something that really, really matters for horror books. You have to look at a character and see what's happening to them and be like, wow, that's horrible. You have to be able to put yourself in their shoes.
Sure. I think this gets to something interesting about the horror genre, and I think it allows us to observe that you appreciate a certain amount of richness, complexity, nuance when it comes to the horror novels that you really respond to. I'm thinking, okay, if we have literary fiction where the character is quote unquote unlikable,
Mm-hmm.
it's the reason I'm usually pushing back against that is that 9 times out of 10, and I know this is like a snotty answer, 9 times out of 10, that's like the point of the book.
Yeah.
The point of the book is it's a character study about a horrible person who, or, quote unquote, or is maybe unhinged or they're a bit of a mess. But the thing of it is, if like you have an unlikable character in a literary fiction contemporary book, or maybe it's Richard III, or maybe it's Salieri and Amadeus. The whole point is like, what are their motivations? Like, why are they assholes? That's the richness and point of the story. Yeah, it's you don't want to have a beer with them, but like, what are they up to? What are they doing? So if we're distilling that down to they're unlikable because we're unpacking what their motivations are, and we're kind of going along with the ride to see what kind of a mess they make. Okay, well that's the point of that book. If we're distilling and being reductive in our look at horror, in my brain, I'm like, well, we have to like these characters because we have to, and I'm speaking in very simplistic terms, be rooting for them to, and you used this S word, survive.
Mm-hmm.
However, I think it's worth putting on the table, just kind of play with as an argument. It doesn't have to be the end-all be-all singular point or arc of a horror novel to be, oh my gosh, how is my character going to survive this threat? Or it's another human, or it's supernatural, or it's a house that's going to eat them, or it's the water. I think books can be more complex than that. I'm picking up that you like that when that happens.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I'm about to use an example that isn't a book,
I was going to
but
say Stranger Things. The whole thing is, oh, well, are they going to beat the evil thing and not get killed by it? Okay, hooray. They survived.
and part of me wonders if this desire in a way kind of breaks I don't know the rules of horror the way that I know the rules of fantasy
I
and
think
romance books.
Matthew
And
Lillard.
what I mean by rules, listeners, that for romance specifically just because it's the easiest one. The rule for romance is that it has to end in a happily ever after or happy for now, meaning that the characters are in love and together by the end of the book. If they are broken up, it is not a romance book. It is a fiction book with a romance subplot, or insert any other genre with a romantic subplot. Fantasy, you have to have magic or something supernatural or paranormal or fantastical, literally. There has to be magic. There has to be something that is beyond, you know, our basic human conception slash understanding of our actual world for it to qualify as a fantasy book. And could they go on a hero's journey? Yeah, sure. That's not necessarily the rule, but it has to have something fantastical to be fantasy. You know, write a literary fiction book. If you put a unicorn in it, it's a fantasy book now. Good job. So, and someone's going to be pissed at me for saying that, but that's just the rule. And I'm wondering for horror, is the rule that someone has to survive? Because I don't know. I genuinely don't know, because to break, if this would be breaking the horror genre, I would be fine if, you know, I got to the end and people didn't necessarily survive or come out of it unscathed. My first foray into the Twilight Zone was Time Enough at Last, which is the episode where, and spoiler alert for something that came out 60, I mean, not 60, but like, well, damn, I guess almost 60 years. Anyway, easily. It's older than the two people speaking right now. So, where we have this character, all he wants to do is read. He loves to read. He's talking about books all the time to the chagrin of everyone around him. And at the end of what happens is there's a major catastrophe calamity that he survives because he was in the vault of the bank that he worked at when disaster struck. And somehow, magically, there's plenty of food. The books are intact. Building structures are intact. Just suspend disbelief. But what happens at the very end of the episode is that he stumbles or something happens. His glasses slide off his face and crack and break. And he had a very particular prescription. He needed these glasses to see. So not only did his glasses break, but he can't read anymore. He has to refigure out how to traverse the world. He wanted time to read. And at the end of the show, even though he is alive, he cannot do the one thing that he desperately wanted to do. If someone could take that and put that in book form, I would be fine with that as a horror book, because that has stuck with me for over 20 years now. From when I watched it when I was a little kid, I was just like, this sucks. Like, oh my God. And it left such an impression. And I'm just like, yeah, no, horror could do that to me. I could be left altered and not even necessarily feel like relief at the fact that my characters or my particular character has survived, because that's kind of just what horror is. And I would be fine with that. I don't know if other people would, though.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. You mentioned the rule around romance and the couple has to be together, at least for now.
Yeah.
I think there's just so many cliched horror movies out there that have probably warped my brain. And the formula seems to be that the final girl or person is there and fine at the end and probably sitting in an ambulance. But also, we don't know if the killer's dead yet. But yeah, they're safe for now.
For now.
And you're like, no, let's put them down a spiral and make them.
No, truly, I am like, the thing about Final Girl Survival Guide that really stuck with me is that book is about, Grady Hendrix really tapped into something that I found interesting, which is like the psychological spiral that comes with surviving all of these horrible things. Our main character in that book has like devoted her entire life to trying to continue to survive because of what she's been through. Mm-hmm. Because she knows that if the slightest thing is left out of place, that could be the end of her life. All of her time spent trying to survive could, be for naught. And I was very intrigued by that, especially because the premise is that someone is going around and killing the Final Girls
Mm-hmm.
because she was part of a Final Girl support group. And I hope I'm saying that because I know there was another Final Girls book by Riley Sager at the same time that I haven't read, but there was a time where those were really popular, and I really like the idea of like, because here's the thing. When you read these books and you are diving into horror and you read these characters surviving these horrible, crazy circumstances, unfortunately for my overactive mind, I am always worried about what happens to them next. When I read a romance book, I'm not as invested in what happens afterwards for the characters. I'm like, you know what? They're happy. Maybe they get married. Maybe they don't. Maybe they have kids if they can. Maybe they don't. Whatever. The book is over when they are happy and together. I'm not too concerned with what comes after. But with a horror book, I very deeply care about what's going to come next for these characters. Like how do you continue? How do you go on afterwards?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the thing that does make the genre stand out, is that kind of question lets you really sit with the characters longer than other books do or other genres do. So, yeah.
Of the books that you have listed today, I'm curious, or even just generally over the last year, do you have a contender, not for favorite book of the year, specifically though for favorite horror of the book of the year, in all caps so far? What is sort of in your regard? What's getting the highest? What's got a 4.1? What's got a 4.4 right now?
So, funnily enough, I do not recommend this book to people.
Oh.
Every time I talk about this book, I'm like, I do not recommend this book, but it's also so well written.
Is it the water book?
Huh?
Is it the
No,
water book?
it's You Weren't Meant to Be Human.
Oh,
Jeff,
sure.
that book effed me up. Like, I don't want you to have to edit that out later. That book really messed me up for days. Me and my friends are still talking about this book. I think I finished that book. I got it on like October 10th. I finished it October 11th, and it took me so long to read and finish another book after that. That book horrified me.
Just gonna do a fourth wall break and look at the camera and say that is a book that is 337 pages long. You read it in a day. Okay.
Jeff, I kid you not, I could not put it down. I was thinking about it nonstop.
Amazing.
In terms of what I think overall is the best written book, and it's also a book I don't intend to reread, I think The Reformatory was up there. And I came out years ago, or several years ago, and it's been on my list ever since, and I just got down to reading it.
Amazing.
But I feel like every other book that I named today, I could see myself rereading at one point or another.
Okay.
But those two books, I think it tells me something that I have very little intention of touching those books again. Like, oh, yeah, those books really, really sat with me for a while.
Wow.
And yeah, those were hard reads. One, for two completely different reasons. Like I said, it took me about a month to read all of The Reformatory, not just because it's a long book, but because it was so emotionally hard hitting that I would have to really pace myself with it. Whereas You Weren't Meant to Be Human, I feel like that book read faster, but it was like a train wreck. Like I could not stop watching the train wreck, essentially. And the thing about it is that with these other books that I read, I think that because I'm an avid reader and I read as a hobby, reading for me is fun. I don't know if I would describe, and this is not me saying that this is a bad thing, but I don't know if I would describe reading those two books as me reading for fun. I don't know if I was having fun reading those. And I don't mean that in a bad way or a negative way, but that's just how invested I was in them. But pretty much every other book, I was like, yeah, I was having fun. I was having a good time.
All right.
Yeah.
Oh.
So...
Are you currently in the middle of a horror book, or is there one on your list you want to start next?
I literally just finished The Buffalo Hunter yesterday or Saturday. Listener, it is a Monday as we speak.
Mm-hmm.
So
Or is it?
I'm rereading Frankenstein before Guillermo del Toro Love of My Life's movie comes out. So that and Frankenstein's shorter
Sure.
book than
Sure.
people realize.
Sure.
So I'm diving into that. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else on my hold on, I have to look in my handy dandy stack of books that I have to read that I keep right next to me. And not really.
Okay.
I've read a lot of horror this year, so I'm sure something's going to catch my attention sooner rather than later. But I've been going back and forth between horror and nonfiction. And yeah, we're
Frankenstein.
at how many books have I read this year so far? Too many.
58.
74.
What?
It's in a wild year.
Amazing. Are you gonna make it to 100 or maybe 90?
I would say I'll probably get close to 90,
Okay.
but I am closer to 85. I am slowing down a bit. Unless I read a bunch of like manga or something like that. By the way, listener, all reading counts
Yes.
as reading. If you read something, you've
Yes.
read.
Manga, graphic novel, yes.
All of that counts. Now, is most of my reading manga and graphic novels? No. But if I do find myself reading a series, then I might hit the and then there are certain rereads that I've done that I don't necessarily count just because I'm too lazy to go about logging them as
Sure.
rereads. So yeah. But anyway, I hope that this, encourages some people to try a new genre. Horror is very polarizing, and I understand why. But as a person who did not think that they liked horror, and turns out that they actually really like it, I do hope that it makes other people give it a shot.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
And it's not just about surviving. And
No.
it's not just about mummies. It's so much more than that.
It's more than puppets.
Yes. Roddy, what a pleasure. Thanks for hanging out, talking about horror
Thanks, Jeff.
novels.
This is so much fun.
Oh, I don't know if that list is comprised or typed, but wow, if you could send it to me,
I will send it to you. It's a lot.
Terrific. All right, everybody, that's another episode of A Little Too Quiet. Happy spooky season to everyone out there, and I hope you have a great Halloween. Remember to rate, review, subscribe. Evergreen Podcasts, be damned. It is the middle of the Friends of Libraries week, so thanks to the Friends of the Ferndale Library for making this podcast a reality. Thanks, Roddy, for hanging out.
Thanks, Jeff.
Bye, everybody.